All right, ladies, it's the last week, and it was crazy to me that it was so appropriate for the Easter week. So, what a wonderful thing to be able to read about Jesus and his death, resurrection, and ascension during this week. So, for day one, it was about the widow's son and that Jesus gives back the son to his mother. And I have a few things for you. First of all, I started to become curious about the distances. So it was 40 miles from Nazareth to Capernaum and 120 miles from Capernaum to Jerusalem. So Nazareth's kind of in the middle. One route that I found went through Magdala on the coast. So it'd go around the Sea of Galilee and then down and over. Again, you have to avoid Samaria. And then the other one went through Nazareth. So, Nain is where the lady lost her son. It's about 8 miles from Nazareth to Nain, but it was kind of in a wrong way. So it seemed like it was a little bit out of their way to go there, but it might not have been. It may have been the scenic route. It was 100 miles from Bethlehem to Nazareth, so not quite as far from Capernaum to Jerusalem. And it took Mary about 8 to 10 days walking to get there when she was pregnant. Nain means charming in Hebrew, so apparently it's a very pretty little city. And I'm sending out an article about how much walking Mary did. I thought you guys would be really interested in reading about that because the guy just tracks all these places, and it's kind of stunning. All right, so the widow. Common logic that we have was that the woman couldn't pay for her own property. She couldn't own property. When her husband died, she had nothing left. She had to move to the son's house, and that legally she was subordinate to her male relatives. She had no other resources. So that was common logic. But however, I'm not quite sure that's true because one historian said that a third of all property was owned by women, that Romans, a law, had both men and women owned property, but they could not own anything until the father died. So after that, they could own stuff. Dowries were given when the women were married, but if there was a divorce or death, if the husband died or left her, she got the dowry back. So she also could have stuff. Widows could actually be wealthy. There have been women followed Jesus and supported him. We don't know that they were widows, but they certainly don't mention the husbands. There was an inscription and letters to show possession and a transfer of land by a lady to another lady. So we have some physical evidence where someone one lady sold something to another. Jewish widows that were like Greek and Roman. They showed papyrus fragments that showed the property disputes between two women, and this was a Jewish fragment. Let's see, papyrus show women gathering property from their mother, so there was some suggestion there. The widow with 2 coins. Okay, so this is an amazing. We focus on the radical gift of that, but the parable only means something and only makes sense if the coins were hers to give away. So if she's giving away someone else's coins, it wasn't a significant gift, but so she could own something because those were her coins. In Naomi and Ruth, Naomi tells the girls to go back to their mother's house, not their father's house, go to their mother's house. So that is significant. If the father was either in the picture or there was something going on, they would send it. The laws say go to the father's house, and yet she sent them to the mother's house. And that maybe they had funds to help, or maybe the dads were not living anymore. Let's see. Naomi seemed to have an active role in the selling of the parcel of land. So when Ruth was being by the kinsman by Boaz was being redeemed, that he said Ruth has this parcel of land to sell. So it didn't go to him. She still had ownership, and he was going to sell it for her. There was repeated instruction to care for widows and orphans and strangers in Exodus and Deuteronomy and Isaiah. In Acts 6, there's food distribution to poor widows. 1 Timothy, the family should look after widows. Mark and Luke, Jesus was judging the Pharisees and others who devour widows' houses, which means that they owned houses, that they actually had the houses for them to be devoured. Okay, day 2. Jairus's daughter, and it's in Judaism. So I started looking up. They had the people crying and saying, laughing at him when she said she's just asleep. And so I started looking up the mourning process in Jewish tradition. So the principal mourners, that you had various degrees of mourners. You had your first degree and second degree and third degree. And your first degree mourners were always the relatives. And then as your second, your closest relatives, then you had your next closest relatives. But you could get mourners that would come and for a fee help you mourn for your loved one. The rabbinic laws of mourning do not apply to those under 13. So all the things that you have to do don't apply to people if they were under 13 when they died, or if they were only alive for less than 30 days. So upon receiving news, you were supposed to recite a blessing and a very particular thing, and then you were supposed to tear your clothes. Now, parents had to tear their clothes specifically over the left side of their heart, and it had to be clearly visible. On other relatives had to do it on the right side of their heart. Non-Orthodox Jews could make a tear in a black ribbon and pin it on them, so that you could have, they were to tear something, but they didn't have to tear their clothes. And it was supposed to be clearly visible, and it was, about an inch or two in their clothing. If a child of the deceased wanted to change clothes, the same tear had to happen in the spot. Now, they couldn't sew that tear after the funeral, but someone else could. So they usually had someone else sew up those spots for them. Eulogies were usually said, but they were forbidden on Friday afternoon because of Sabbath. Each month's new moon, the 4 days between Yom Kippur and Sukkot, and then during the month of Nisan. So you were not allowed eulogies for a funeral for that time of period. The burial was as soon as possible after death, even for executed criminals. So the goal was to execute them, or, as soon as death happened, to get them buried. Now, it could be delayed if for the honor of the deceased, if they had family from far away that had to travel. So news had to get out there and get back. They would wait for that. And also if there had to be decisions about what cemetery. So they had to choose a place, and that was important. In many traditional funerals, the casket would be carried by the hearse to the grave, and there would be 7 stages, and at each they would be accompanied by 7 recitations of Psalm 91. So they would recite Psalm 91 7 times, and there would be pauses at each point. Now, if you weren't having a eulogy, you didn't do that. You just moved right along because there was a time issue according to the sacredness of the day. Mourners would help fill the grave after the funeral. Usually each person would do 3 shovelfuls, and they originally you're supposed to do it with a shovel turned upside down, and you would scoop it and fill like that, to show that death was not the final statement, and that they would not be there for forever. But when they do it anymore, and it quickly resolved to only the first few people, and it was only the first few shovelfuls because it just took too long. When they were done with the shovelfuls, they would stick the shovel into the dirt upright and not hand it to the next person, so they wouldn't pass on their grief. Everyone had to hold their own grief, and they didn't pass it on. Let's see, participating in the burial, this was good mitzvah, or mitzvah, because it was one that benefited the deceased, and the deceased could offer no repayment or gratitude, so the action was pure. So you wanted to do things that would be pure gifts, and that would count better for you. And helping at a funeral, and particularly in burial, was the one thing you could do for sure, where they couldn't even offer gratitude. So it was the most purest form of action. So there were several stages of mourning. The first one was, of course, intense mourning, and you would mourn very intensely until after the burial. Stage 2 would be about 7 days, and you couldn't listen to music or go to concerts of any kind. Any joyous event, so nothing unless you and that included marriage or bat mitzvahs, unless absolutely necessary, unless there was some way that you had, for some reason you had to go. And the 7 days after the funeral, if I'm correct, I think it's called a Shiva. And so people would gather in your homes, and they would, mirrors would be covered, so you didn't have to look at yourself. You wouldn't wear makeup. You wouldn't shower. You wouldn't shave for those 7 days. After 30, so then you have 30 days after, and it has another name, and I think it's the Schlossen. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that horribly. You can't remarry during that period of time. You're not supposed to shave, and you're not supposed to cut your hair. Now, that's more important for the men folk than for the girls, because they would wear their hair long. And the deceased during a certain portion, and it may have been the first full year, but I know it was the first part of the year, they could benefit from any good that you did in their name. So they could gain points for it in the afterlife in whatever you did in their name. So people would do things in honor of the dead. If a parent died, 12 months was observed of mourning. So, let's see, and then a year later, they would have commemoration for parents and children, siblings, spouses. And it would be a full Shiva, so it'd be a full day of memory, and you would recite prayers, you would tear your clothes, you would light candles, and you would visit the grave. So, and one of the key things is that you'd place a small stone on the grave, because they didn't have gravestones for the longest time. That was one way to remember where that place was. Afterwards, it was just a way to commemorate the person that you love. And it was a way that it would be there forever. So instead of flowers that would fall, die and fly away or whatever, the stone would stay. So it was a way to commemorate them for eternity. Okay, day 3 is Lazarus. Lazarus' name meant God has helped. So it was a past tense. Isn't that curious? And it's from the Hebrew form of Eliezer, and Eliezer's name means God is my help. So Lazarus, it was a form of it, but it meant it was in the past tense, so God has helped. And that was kind of curious. It was prophetic in a way. According to tradition, Lazarus never smiled during the 30 years after his resurrection. And he didn't smile because of the 3 days he saw, while in hell, he saw all the souls that would stay in hell. And so it so overcame him that he could not smile after that. Except he did one time, they say, and it was when he saw a man steal a pot, and he smilingly said, "The clay steals the clay." And that was the only time he smiled. Lazarus' relics, his relic remains are everywhere. Constantinople, which is Istanbul now, France, Russia, Cyprus. I mean, it's just all over the place. He's a little bit everywhere. Bethany is now Al-Azariah, which I know that's wrong, but it means of Lazarus. It's on the southeast slope of the Mount of Olives. So it's Jerusalem is here, and the ridge of Mount of Olives, and Bethany is just on the other side. I'm going to send you a map of Bethany and a picture of the tomb that they think Lazarus was in. Jesus actually ascended from that same area. So Bethany is here. The Mount of Olives is just above them, so he ascended from the vicinity. And it was on the Bethany side. Because Lazarus seems to play such a minor role in the household, so like he doesn't, even though he would technically be the patriarch, he doesn't speak to Jesus first. He doesn't seem to be a part of any of the meetings. He doesn't seem to be asking of Jesus of anything. So they think that he was the youngest in the family, and that Mary probably was the oldest, and that he was that he wasn't of age or wasn't in position to be the spokesperson. Okay, so the family may have been pretty wealthy. Mary poured the perfume worth a year's wages on Jesus's feet, and there's no suggestion that she got that in an ill-gotten way or whatever. There were other well-off ladies connected to Jesus or to the Christians: Lydia, Chloe, John Mark's mom. And Jesus may have spent the last few days before being murdered at Mary and Martha and Lazarus' house. That seems to be a suggestion. All right, day 4, Jesus' empty tomb. So, okay, here's some curious things that I found about that time period. So you hear about the mother of James, who was the wife of Alphaeus, or the who has a son named Alphaeus. And as some of the traditions that come from that or surround that is that the mother of James was also the wife of Cleophas, and Alphaeus is the Greek for Cleophas, they think. So they think the mother of James is the same, and the wife of Cleophas, or the wife of Alphaeus, is the same person. It's all one Mary. And that some people say that when you trace the line of Joseph, that he died really early on in the relationship with Mary, and that Cleophas was Joseph's brother. And so Mary had married Joseph's brother, and that's who the other children came from. So now the brothers are listed: James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon. That's been named in Matthew 13:55. And Mark also did it as well. Joseph is also known as Joseph, so they think that they named one of the boys after Joseph. Tradition says that the sisters, he had 2 sisters, and that was also named, and they were named Mary and Salome, or Salome, and that Jesus moved his mother and his brothers to Capernaum, and that can be traced to John 2:12. And it says that he went with them and stayed there for a while. So they think that he actually moved them there. And there was no mention of Joseph at that time. Mother and brothers also sought him in Mark 3:31, but no Joseph there. And then Acts 1:14, mother and brothers were part of the group that were in the early days of the church, but again, no Joseph. So they think that, she might, mother of James, maybe also referring to Jesus's mother. It could be a whole nother person too. It could be her sister-in-law at this point. So we don't know, but it's just curious that there's all sorts of stuff swirling around. Whoever she was, there are parts of her in France and Italy. So she has different bits of her in different places. James, Jesus' brother, it looks like he, according to tradition, died in AD 62, and he was the leader of the Jerusalem Christians. Paul writes about him and says that his conversion was, he could trace that to the appearance of Christ. Now, some historians will say, now the brothers weren't antagonistic against him. They didn't understand him. And so the more they watched, the more they understood, and they were completely connected by the time of his appearance. So there's it's not always like when they went to get him, they thought he was crazy. They were trying to figure out what was going on and if he was okay. Some people claim it's really antagonistic, but it isn't always. They don't always agree with that. So then, let's see, Paul says that 3 years after Paul's conversion, James was an important leader in Jerusalem, that he was the chief spokesperson in the Council of Jerusalem regarding Paul to the Gentiles. So in getting Paul into toward the Gentiles, James was part of that, and that's in Acts 15:13, and the final visit of Paul in Acts 28:18. Or that may be 21:18. The Catholics call him the first bishop of Jerusalem. So they have him as a key part of the beginning of that church. Now remember, the Catholics have that the initial bishops, there were no popes. Initially there were bishops, and they were bishops of the key places, the key cities. And through that became a council, and as the authority moved to Rome, then that's when the bishops there was a council, and they positioned themselves, and got a pope. So that's really a horrible explanation, but it's simple. Okay, and day 5. Day 5 is about the ascension. And here's the thing I'm going to send you a couple of maps from that. Here's a curious thing. So I found this article that talked about the 7 differences between Galilee and Judea in the time of Jesus. So, when the Great Commission was Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and into all the earth. And I did not know this. I didn't pay attention. That's the truth. I didn't pay attention until this study. So I'm really grateful for it. But I didn't realize how separated Judea and Galilee were. Like they really are quite a distant apart. And Jerusalem and Nazareth and Capernaum, they're quite far apart. And we talked about that earlier. So you think that, when people say Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, ends of the earth, that you're supposed to do, the people your closest influence people, then you go out to, your next phase of influence, and then Samaria is your, the foreigners that you don't see eye to eye with, and then the ends of the earth are the people who are from around the world. So you're kind of opening your area up as you go. But this one guy wrote quite a long time ago in 2007 that there were 7 differences that we could simplify and surmise between Galilee and Judea, the folks there. So number 1, there was racial difference, because that the area of the former northern kingdom of Israel had a more mixed population. And so they had conservative towns like Nazareth and Capernaum, but they were right next to largely pagan cities. So, and they're very Greek, like Tiberias and Sepphoris, or Sepphoris, whichever way you want to pronounce that. Sepphoris was very close to Nazareth. And so you've got these, and at one point was considered the capital of that area, and that before they moved the capital to Tiberias. So you've got this very Greek influence in the northern kingdom area in Galilee, particularly. Geographically, Galilee was separated from Judea by the non-Jewish territory of Samaria. Now we know that they were kind of cousins. The Samaritans were cousins, and then they were also separated from Perea in the southeast corner with the Decapolis. So they were very cut off geographically. Politically, Galilee was under a separate administration than Judea was, and as particularly since about the 10th century BC. They were not unified within the whole group, and they had a native Herodian prince, supposedly, while Judea and Samaria, since about the same time, had been under direct rule from a Roman prefect. So they were even ruled by different thought processes, a Herodian prince versus a Roman prefect. Economically, Galilee, now here's a curious thing that I would not have suspected. Galilee offered better agricultural and fishing resources than the more mountainous territory of Judea, making the wealth of some Galileans the envy of their southern neighbors. So we thought everybody was poor, or at least I did, in Galilee, poor old Galileans. And really that's not the truth, that they had way more resources available to them. Culturally, the Judeans despised their northern neighbors. They considered them country cousins, really bumpkins or backwoodsy, even though, financially they had a lot more resources, but they really looked down their nose at them culturally. They felt like they lacked Jewish sophistication, and because they were connected to the Hellenistic other cities, that they weren't as pure and weren't as awesome. Then linguistically, Galileans spoke a distinctive form of Aramaic, which we would consider like it had a real twang to it. So it'd be like Texas or Boston, real thick accent. And the Judeans made fun of them. Had made fun, and you could tell distinctly the minute they opened their mouth, they knew very quickly that they were from Galilee. And religiously, the Judean opinion was that Galileans were lax. They just weren't very up on things because they lived near the Hellenistic influences, and so they didn't do proper ritual. They didn't, and of course, how could they? Because the temple was in Jerusalem, so they couldn't get there all the time, and it wasn't easy to get to. So they just they just, again, were backwoodsy and awkward. So he says, even the best, the most wealthy Jewish Galilean in the first century Jerusalem when he was in Jerusalem, he was not amongst his own people. He would have considered himself felt like a foreigner, like an Irishman going to London or a Texan in New York. They just would have felt awkward and odd there. So this one guy says, really what we're missing when we read to read Matthew, we really need to look that this is a story of Jesus of Nazareth, that all of those components come into play in that book, and that we are missing out when we don't consider that Nazareth was very distinctly different and not in the ways that we thought. So my question is, why would he say Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and Nazareth? So here's some things I thought about it. Maybe Jerusalem was where they were at. It was. And so maybe Jesus was saying that you start where you're at, like wherever you are, that's where you're Jerusalem. And that it was also the closest city or space for impact. So Jerusalem, people were coming and going out of Jerusalem, and that it was he wanted them to start there because it was an epicenter for culture and particularly religious culture among the Jews. It was obviously assigned to them by Christ, and they weren't culturally in that Judean, right? So to say that they were going to who their closest people were, their closest influence really would have been in Galilee. So they should have gone home to do their closest influence. But for Jesus to say, be in Jerusalem, start in Jerusalem, was a distinctive. So Judea, that seems kind of, although Judea surrounds Jerusalem, but you would think he would say Jerusalem, then Galilee, go home and get your people on board at home. Samaria, it's like, why would you say that? Kind of the weird, awkward enemy, the cousin that didn't fit in, the people that you kind of despise as dogs almost. Why not just go south of Jerusalem and Judea and say Egypt? Have that be the place where you would be your next level of foreigners to go to. And, I think that maybe it was, you're going to the people you dislike. Maybe that was the whole point. I had a couple of notes about Jerusalem. Jerusalem killed their savior, so that would make them an undesirable place to start. Judea rejected him. They didn't like, so they rejected Jesus, and it specifically in Jerusalem, but in Judea in general, he had a lot of trouble in Judea. The Jewish people didn't like Samaria. And I think sometimes, really, if I were giving that list, it'd be like the ends of the earth would sound easier than the Jerusalem where I'm considered a bumpkin and who killed the person I love, and then Judea who rejected him and also thinks that I'm not worth much anyway, and then Samaria who I don't like at all, and I don't even know why they're part of the whole program. That it seems like Greece or Rome or some other place would be easier. Now I don't know that that's true, but I'm just thinking. So the question is, what is our Jerusalem? Is it where we know that it could be where we find ourselves? It could be where a place that needs Jesus, or a place that we are assigned, a place that rejected Jesus. Maybe our Judaism is our family, a place that we feel awkward in, but we're supposed to be a part of, that we can't get away from. And then our Samaria are places that we don't like. Maybe it's more about a place where we don't want to be. That's where we should be going, where there's a history, but we're connected to. Anyway, that's it for this time. I hope you have a great time. I think it's going to be a little long, but I enjoyed sharing all this with you, and I miss you and love you all. Bye-bye.